The formation of the New Testament canon. I'm returning to biblical stuff again today. Many non-Christians may be puzzled by this. Why is a non-Christian so interested in the Bible? But I am interested in this stuff. I'm interested in history, literature, mythology, society, and it can't be denied that Christianity and the Bible have played a big part in that. My interest, though, is academic. I would have the same interest in the Muslim or Hindu scriptures, but my reason for focusing on Christian and biblical issues is that I had a lot of training in this many years ago, and I may as well put that training to some use. Also, I simply don't have the background, knowledge, and training to respond to other religious movements in the same way. It's also true that in some ways Christianity is more important now than it has been for a while, not in a good way. Of course, I'm thinking mainly about the USA and mainly about evangelical Christianity. They're important to us because they're important there. Evangelical Christianity has a disproportionate and largely negative influence in the USA, especially in politics these days, but also in society in general. And what happens in the USA affects us too, for better or for worse. So today, largely as an academic exercise, I want to take a brief look at how the New Testament came into being. In particular, why were certain books included and some not? Why did some struggle to be included while others just breezed straight in? There were several criteria that the early church used to determine whether a particular book that was in circulation in the early church could be regarded as canonical, as authoritative within the church. But this process took several centuries, longer in some parts of the early church than in others. For example, while the book of Revelation was widely recognized as canonical in the Western Church by the late 4th century CE, it wasn't until the 8th century CE that it was accepted as canonical by the Eastern Church. There were 5 main criteria for determining whether or not a book could be regarded as canonical. They are apostolic origin. Now, books needed to be written by an apostle or someone closely associated with an apostle. This was important for establishing a direct link to Jesus' own teaching and to the teaching of the early Christian community. Most of the books that we see in the New Testament today are attributed to an apostle or to a close companion of one of the apostles. Mark, Luke, and Acts are not attributed to any of the apostles, nor are the epistles of James and Jude, just to give some examples. But each of these was thought to have been written by a close companion of the apostles. A notable exception to this is Hebrews, which is anonymous. Now, many of the books that were at the time attributed to the apostles or to their close associates, most biblical scholars today would argue that they were probably not written by the people to which they're attributed. If the early Christians knew what we now know about some of these books, would they have made it into the canon? Maybe they would, based on criteria 3 and 4, but before we get there, let's look at the second criteria, and that is orthodoxy. The contents of the books had to be consistent with the established and accepted beliefs and teachings of the church. Now, what exactly that was not particularly easy to define, hence so many debates within the early church, so many councils to try to settle controversies. Personally, I don't think the orthodoxy was ever really quite settled, but any text that was thought to contain heretical ideas or doctrinal errors was, in principle, excluded. Hebrews struggled a bit with this criterion too. Now, I think an honest reading of the Bible today would reasonably raise doubts about whether the New Testament contains a single cohesive theology. But that's what they were aiming for, at least it's what they claimed they were aiming for. I think some, shall we say, creative license was taken with some of the texts to smooth over some of the difficulties. And I think the reason this was necessary was because of the next 2 criteria. And the third criteria is Catholicity or universal acceptance. The book had to be widely accepted and used by a large portion of the early Christian communities. Books that were only recognised here and there in a specific region or by a small group were less likely to be included. Some of the books that were not ultimately considered canonical on the basis of this criterion were, for example, the Gospel of Peter, the Acts of Paul, the Epistle of Barnabas. There's quite a long list of them. But this was often not the only reason that they were rejected. There were also doubts raised about their apostolic authorship and also questions about their orthodoxy. They were particularly suspicious of Gnostic elements. We won't go into that here. In fact, these issues may have been why these books were only accepted in some circles. So these criteria are not independent of each other. But it's worth noting that Hebrews, for example, was accepted because of its wide acceptance and use within the church, despite doubts about its authorship and questions about its theology. The same could be said of the Epistle of Jude. So wide acceptance may in the end have trumped authorship and orthodoxy, and this probably led to some of that creative thinking I mentioned before, to make them fit. The fourth criteria is quite similar to this, and it's the question of the liturgical use of the book. Books that were commonly read and used in Christian worship services and in liturgies were given preference. This demonstrated their practical value to the community. As I said, I think this overlaps very much with the previous criterion. And again, this might trump orthodoxy and authorship. The fifth and final criterion is rather more, or shall we say, airy-fairy? And that's the question of inspiration. The early church believed that canonical books were inspired by the Holy Spirit. Maybe this could be used as a final catch-all for those books that seem not quite to pass the tests of authorship and orthodoxy. I think maybe there's a bit of circular reasoning going on here too. Maybe this is not actually a distinct criterion. Maybe a book was considered inspired if it met the previous four criteria, especially 3 and 4, Catholicity and liturgical use. The argument would probably go something like this. The Holy Spirit has testified to the authenticity of these books by ensuring that they're widely distributed and used. Therefore, the Holy Spirit must have inspired those books. So the process by which the books that we today regard as the New Testament came to be accepted as authoritative was slow and not exactly smooth. In the end, I suspect that use and popularity won the day, often overriding issues of authorship and orthodoxy. Certainly, if we were to look again today at many of these books in terms of authorship and orthodoxy, I think several of them would probably fall short. Indeed, I think they may fail the third and fourth criteria too, Catholicity and liturgical use. I suspect there are certain core books, the Gospels, Romans, Hebrews, Paul's letters to the Corinthians, and maybe some of his other authentic letters, the book of Revelation, unfortunately. I think these play a far more important role in the church and in the development of Christian doctrine and in teaching and so on than do many of the others, although these other books may be given the occasional nod. So why have I bothered telling you all this? Well, first of all, because I find the process interesting. I think, for instance, that something can cement its place in our culture or in a subculture such as the Christian community. It becomes popular, it becomes widely used and accepted, and it's only then that questions of its truth, its accuracy, its appropriateness are asked. And sometimes I think then, when we've got to that point, we have to bend the truth a little bit to find the reasons for keeping it. It's become so established that reasons for not accepting it have to be glossed over, that they have to be explained away. Its initial acceptance was probably not a rational process, and no amount of reason is likely to undo that acceptance. In the case I've been considering here, there's no way that the book of Revelation, for example, would ever be removed from the canon if it could be clearly demonstrated that it did not have apostolic or near apostolic authorship or that it contained doctrines that were clearly not orthodox and clearly not consistent with the theology and teaching of other parts of the Bible. I think both of those things are true, actually. But although I think within the church some communities actually recognise it, what they will do is they will simply sideline the book. In my time in the Anglican Church, you rarely heard a sermon on any part of the book of Revelation. In other Christian communities, it probably shows up in every sermon. Because of that, I also don't think that the book of Revelation, just to take this example, would ever meet criteria 3 and 4 these days, either Catholicity and liturgical use, let alone authorship and orthodoxy. The book of Revelation today is one of those books that's widely used and widely accepted within certain elements of the Christian church and not others. But it's not going to go away. The church, like so many human institutions, locks itself into positions which often seem untenable today, but it can't shake them off. They've become part of its identity. Really, they're the baggage that it carries around with it. They're a millstone around its neck. And I think that's true of many of the church's traditions today. I'm pretty sure that there are certain sections of the Christian community that would like to jettison the book of Revelation. But because of tradition, because of decisions made in the distant past under very different circumstances, this can't be done. I'm sure this is true of many other institutions within society too. The legal system, for example. The way the US is shackled to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Let me know in the comments of any other instances where you think this may be true.